Hello and welcome to An Old Man Watches. And today I am going to be talking about the 1979 slasher horror movie Savage Weekend, which is, as we'll discuss a bit, calling it a slasher movie is perhaps a little bit debatable. We'll talk about why. But in this film, we meet Marie Pettis, who has recently divorced her husband Greg, who's a politician. And to decompress from that, she leaves for a weekend trip to upstate New York with her new boyfriend, stockbroker named Robert, her sister Shirley, and their openly gay friend Nikki. It's the 70s, so some of the rural locals in upstate New York aren't too accepting of Nikki's open homosexuality. But it turns out he's pretty handy with his fists, though, and he turns the tables on his would-be harassers. The group's holiday destination is an isolated farmhouse that Robert has purchased from a local man named Otis. He's also hired Otis to build him a schooner to go sailing on the nearby lake. Robert, it seems, has some money. Otis, along with engineer Jay and lumber supplier Mac, are all working on the project up at a barn near the house. So, there's quite a lot of people around the place. And Jay and Shirley quickly hit it off, while Marie finds herself attracted to Mac, which is a bit awkward, what with her new boyfriend Robert being, right here. But as you might surmise from the image on your screen, awkwardness is going to be the least of the group's problems, as a masked murderer begins stalking and killing them one by one. Who is this? Why are they doing it? And will any of the group survive to find out? Well, that's what the movie's about. So from a plot outline perspective, you're probably thinking Savage Weekend sounds like a very standard slasher movie. Group of oversexed people go somewhere isolated and get murdered by a masked whack job. I mean, that's the kind of iconic conception we all have today of slasher movies. And look, that's frankly a fair assessment. Savage Weekend does involve a group of oversexed people going somewhere isolated and getting murdered by a masked whack job. There's a lot of topless ladies in this movie, a lot of gory death scenes, and there's just barely enough plot to string together a justification for both of those sorts of scenes. The movie did in fact attract a lot of negative reviews at the time of release due to its sexual and violent content, much as the slasher genre as a whole would do in the following years. Still, I think that Savage Weekend is a movie with a couple of aspects that are worth discussing, so let's dive in and discuss them. So first of all, Savage Weekend was released in 1979, a year after Halloween showed that slasher movies could be a thing, and in fact a big business. It grossed roughly 20 times what it cost to make. Halloween, that is, not Savage Weekend. And Savage Weekend also came out a year before Friday the 13th, the movie that arguably distilled the slasher genre's formula to more or less its most famous form, promiscuous teens getting slaughtered by a deranged killer over said killer's own psychosexual hang-ups. But this movie was made in 1976, well before either of the two more famous movies that we just mentioned. Now, there were good reasons that Savage Weekend didn't see the light of day for 3 years, and I am going to discuss those. And I think the reason that it did finally get released was a cynical attempt to, cash in on some of that sweet Halloween money. But setting those points aside for the moment, I think it's worth keeping in mind that this is a film that was not a copycat project. Somebody didn't take a look at Halloween and go, how do we turn this up to 11? This movie was conceived and produced before John Carpenter and Jamie Lee Curtis lit the spark of a new genre of horror film. So it's not as derivative as it seems from a simple plot summary. Credit where credit is due. Now, one of the key differences between Savage Weekend and a typical slasher film, and therefore one of the things that I think is interesting to talk about, is the identity of the victims. There are no promiscuous teens here. Instead, it's all promiscuous adults. The characters are in their late 20s or early 30s, and in many cases also come from privileged backgrounds. Now, that's not a deliberate attempt to change the slasher genre's dynamic, of course, because there wasn't a dynamic to change when it was made. But cinema history has definitely made it one of the film's more unusual features. Now, as we now know, Savage Weekend's variation of victims did not catch on. While it would be amusing to suggest that having, white-collar victims hit a little too close to home for movie executives, I think the real reason slasher movies ultimately skewed towards teens as victims were purely financial. Primary fans of such fare tended to be in their late teens and early 20s, and so the script served up characters with whom those audiences would more easily identify. if you're a typical 18-year-old horror movie fan, probably isn't going to care all that much about a stockbroker getting it in the neck, whereas a hapless college or high school student would be a lot more relatable to them. It does raise the interesting question of, how would the development of the slasher movies and the genre's rise and fall have been affected if they were not, as a group of movies, so tightly tied to a single specific audience demographic? I guess we'll never know, but it's interesting that Savage Weekend does kind of present this alternative of what slasher movies could have been and who they could potentially have been targeted at. Finally, we come to the reason that Savage Weekend gathered dust on the shelf for 3 years. It's not very good. You can't really put it any more gently than that. In fact, you could be a lot more rude about it. Writer-director David Paulson was a neophyte as both a writer and a director when he made this. He wrote the script very quickly when the budget for his intended project fell through and he needed a cheaper alternative. The film was then shot in 3 weeks with a cast where many of them were as inexperienced as Paulson, and that definitely shows in their performances. Most of them are simply not very good. Now, several of the cast would ultimately improve and have, solid careers, but not all. Some were just, never cut out for this acting lark. And for those who did improve, I think we can charitably call this movie an opportunity to learn. The most notable cast member, and the only one who already looks accomplished at their craft in this movie, is William Sanderson of Deadwood and True Blood, amongst many other projects. Perhaps the most noteworthy example of the film's technical shortcomings are the numerous occasions in which a boom mic is clearly in shot. This happens a lot. Now, the director's explanation for this was that the mic was supposed to be removed from the shot when the aspect ratio was fixed for theatrical distribution, but that the studio failed to do so. Now, that may well be true, but whoever was actually at fault for this issue, the fact that such a blatant flaw was allowed to make it to screens is a telling indictment of the studio's opinion of and interest in the film beyond a cash grab. So that, all in all, is Savage Weekend, a movie that, despite being made before slasher movies were actually a thing, is in many ways an archetypal example of the genre as it would ultimately emerge, with the exception of who the victims are. Perhaps, David Paulson was just unfortunate in that he was a few years too early with his script. Post-Halloween, he might have got more money and time and made a much more polished and professional-looking film, but that didn't happen. Next time, we finally leave the 70s and 80s, where we've been poking around at a few movies for a while now, for 2001's Spy Kids. But that's next time. Until then, thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.